Hello and welcome to Speak Up, Listen Up, Follow Up, the podcast from the National Guardian's Office. This October, the National Guardian's Office celebrates our 6th annual Speak Up Month. Our theme for this year is Breaking Freedom to Speak Up Barriers. As part of the Awareness Month, we'll be hearing from guests with their own Speak Up stories and reflecting on how we can break the barriers they faced to make a better and safer speaking up culture across healthcare in England. In this episode, Dr. Jayne Chidgey-Clark, National Guardian for the NHS, will be in conversation with Bernadette Rochford MBE. Bernie Rochford spoke up about commissioning at a primary care trust as it was transitioning to become a clinical commissioning group. Following severe detriment, she took her case to the Employment Tribunal. Despite her best efforts, Bernie was not able to fully represent herself and lost her case. Her speaking up experience featured in the Sir Robert Francis Freedom to Speak Up review, as she spoke up to approximately 500 people across 80 layers of management tiers and organisations. Bernie was awarded an MBE in the Queen's Birthdays Honours List in 2021 for her services to the NHS, and has recently been appointed as Principal Freedom to Speak Up Guardian for Essex Partnership University Foundation Trust.
Once I did speak up and I started receiving detriment, that's when the fear kicked in, and it could be a barrier. But I also realised that fear is about what I personally was going to lose, and fear is about loss.
We hope you enjoy this episode, and now over to Jayne.
Oh, good afternoon, Bernie. It's brilliant to see you again and be in this virtual room together and have an opportunity to talk to you on our podcast in this really important time of raising awareness of improving speaking up, because we know how vital it is. And I know that you and I have shared platforms to speak before, and I know that you are one of our valued guardians, but you are also someone who has suffered for speaking up in the past. And I thought it might be great to kick off with, from your perspective, what does freedom to speak up mean to you?
Well, it means many things. And on the one level, on a practical level, it means having an additional safety route to assist colleagues who want to raise any concerns, so that what happened to me doesn't happen to somebody else. But I think on a much deeper level, I see freedom to speak up is a forerunner to freedom of speech. And yes, we may think, especially here in the West, that we have got freedom of speech, but I don't think the true potential of it has yet been realised. And I think it's not until you test it out, speaking up, and then you realise, actually, I haven't got freedom of speech. So for me, I think we first need to create the right environment and ethos where we have the freedom to speak up. And only once we have created that, can we really then have freedom of speech and be able to realise that potential. So for me, this is about freedom to speak up, is about creating a contextual environment where we can really then realise freedom of speech.
I think that distinction between freedom to speak up and freedom of speech is really important. And I guess for me as well, when I talk about freedom to speak up, and obviously I spend a lot of my time talking about freedom to speak up, it's implicit as opposed to explicit. What I'm talking about, in order to have the freedom to speak up, we need to ensure that the message that we're giving as part of a workforce when we're speaking up within it is that will be listened to and acted upon appropriately, because just having the freedom to speak up doesn't explicitly talk about the corollary, the three parts of speaking up. So speaking up is about being heard, it being acted on, as well as the first bit of it. So I guess for our listeners today, I thought it might be helpful just to add that bit in from me, that as well as the freedom of speech coming through a good freedom to speak up culture, I'm meaning, and I think you're meaning, also that bit about being heard. And there's a great quote by Megan Wrights about the silence of missing voices in organisations cost careers, relationships and lives. And when, for me, she's talking about silence, that's not the silence that might be because I'm silenced because I've got barriers to speaking up, but what for me, that silence is also because we're speaking, but we're not being heard. We've got our ears covered, or we're not deeply understanding. We're just, listening at a very surface level, and then that's not leading to action. And that for me isn't speaking up. Speaking up encapsulates all three components: speaking up, listening to understand, and then following up.
I'd agree with you, because on the one hand, in my own case, yes, I had speech and I was able to speak up, I suppose, in a way, but I wasn't heard and the issues weren't acted on. So without all three components to it, I don't really think we have got freedom to speak up.
And we have to be so mindful of that, don't we, in our work environments and as organisations and as individuals in organisations seeking to improve things. Yeah, I wonder if this would be a good moment to move on to talk, because I mentioned the barriers and what people can actively do to overcome the barriers. I wonder if you might spend a few moments talking to our listeners about what barriers you faced when you were speaking up at that difficult time.
I did face many barriers, and I think is the barrier of futility. And I spoke to about 500 different people across 80 plus layers of management, tiers and organisations, and the sheer futility. These were barriers. I mean, I persisted because I think the patient issues were so serious. I persisted, but each one was a knockback barrier. I didn't have fear of speaking up when I first spoke up because I was just doing my job. It was my professional
Absolutely.
duty. I'm a nurse. I had to speak up about these things. So I didn't have that fear of speaking up. Once I did speak up and I started receiving detriment, that's when the fear kicked in, and it could be a barrier. But I also realised that fear is about what I personally was going to lose, and fear is about loss.
That's very powerful, Bernie. That's very, very powerful. And there may be, listeners today who have experienced, some very negative consequences of speaking up, or who are thinking about speaking up and think, oh, well, should I, given, what Bernie's experience was, or if they listened to the previous podcast with, or any of the podcasts with our previous two guests. And that really worries me, that the sort of the why should I put my head above the parapet, and you've said it's because it's the right thing to do. However, and that big however is, no one should suffer negative consequences for doing the right thing, i.e. for patient safety or for worker safety and well-being. That just shouldn't happen. So for you, and I know you now work as a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, you want to be part of that solution of providing the additional route. But even if you weren't, I know you'd be working in your organisation to improve the culture anyway. But what do you think needs to change to make speaking up business as usual in that widest context of speaking up, meaning the listening and following up as well?
I think really we have to change our approach and how we look at this, and look at it from different angles. As we've mentioned before, it's the listening up and the following up that's more of a problem than the speaking up. I see staff are going off sick, or they leave the organisation, they're voting with their feet. So I think people are speaking up in many ways, but it's the listening up and the following up that needs to change. Because unless the back end works, then opening up the shop and inviting more people to speak up creates more of a backlog, futility and harm. So I think we need to turn this on its head in a way. Then I think we need to look at the barriers to listening up and following up. And that takes us then into a whole different domain and minefield and layers of responsibility and accountability. But ultimately it comes down to this is everyone's responsibility, but no one has the remit. It's no one's remit to sort this out. So I think there are many key players out there, and everyone's doing their bit and trying to help, but there are massive gaps between roles and remits. And until that chestnut is sorted out, I really think the rest is just tinkering at the edges. What I mean by responsibility, and that we tend to get it confused with accountability, but I also think, what do we mean by responsibility? And if I break down the words, I like playing with words and thinking things through, but responsibility, does that mean the ability to respond? And when we look at it in that way, the person who is often assigned to look at these cases They may have the responsibility for the case, but really, do they have the ability to respond? Do they have the skills, the appropriate training, and the understanding, that ability to respond? And if we look at people, then are they the responsible person? Are they able to respond? So even if they have the ability in terms of skills, are they able in terms of, have they been given a clear remit? Have they been given the time, the
Yeah.
space, and the resources? If they don't have the ability to respond or are able to respond, don't talk to me about responsible and responsibility. And it's the same for accountability. I see that our senior leaders, they're accountable for everything these days. Are they able to account for what has gone on with these cases? And sometimes they don't hear about these cases until they are so far downstream, it's too late. So I think in order for things to change, we have to just explore a bit further about accountability, responsibility, and is this everybody's responsibility, but still nobody's remit?
Yeah, and I like that distinction, and I like the way you've used the words to really highlight the two parts of it. As you say, we can respond, but do we have the ability? Do we have the skills, training, time? I often hear of very busy managers who've been assigned to investigate something that's been spoken up about, be it through the Guardian route, be it through a line manager route, an HR route, a patient safety route, etc. But have they been equipped by the organisation with the skills and the time to do it in a timely manner, or is it an add-on to an already overstretched day job? And are we setting somebody up to fail in their ability to respond appropriately and in a timely manner to that? I heard recently of an organisation that, in order to try and improve the confidence in the workforce around speaking up matters, they've actually appointed a team, an investigations team, that is not in the direct line management. So rather than traditionally, as what they were doing was they'd give something to a line manager to investigate, they've got this well-trained team whose job it is to do that. And they've increased their response times. They've increased the confidence that this is impartial. So it's quite interesting to see you can look at things in a different way in order to equip people with those right skills. And if I could make an observation about your comment about leaders and accountability and the ability to account for, if you don't know, you can't. And then I think sometimes that's where we see some of the cover-ups, because someone's trying to manage a reputation when something has gone so far down the line that, as you say, it's too far to sort of, could have been averted in the way it's come out. So there is a lot of food for thought in how we both train and support both our managers and our leaders to do the right thing when it comes to responsibility and accountability around speaking up. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. You talked a little bit about some of the system barriers, and I didn't know whether you wanted to draw out anything in particular in relation to system barriers and what you think needs to happen to prevent this type of experience that you had, which you shouldn't have had. And I should have said at the very beginning, I am absolutely clear that I'm sorry that you, as someone who spoke up about important matters, experienced what you did, and there are others who are in a similar position to you. So what needs to happen at a system level from your perspective?
Now, this I could write the book on, because I think, again, we tend to pull out and personalise it and demonise either the whistleblower, and now we're demonising, I think, the senior leaders and the chief execs. It's not a good time for them. But if we move away from the relationships, there are so many things within the wider system and how one thing interacts. I am seeing that IT systems and processes, as well as HR, they've got more impact on patient and staff safety than I think we ever realise. And if these were unpacked, it could lead to far greater patient and staff safety. The NHS could save millions of pounds per year, and many of these cases would never have to go to an employment tribunal, and that's the wrong place for them anyway. There is no controls over this. So I think unless we start looking at this level of detail, we really aren't going to be able to make much progress in these cases.
Bernie. Yeah, thank you so much. You now work as a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. You have done within 2 different organisations. And what advice would you give to managers and leaders who are listening today about the sorts of tips and things they need to be thinking about to truly embed a speaking up culture in their organisation?
If I was them, I'd go back and look at, in particular, the data and the narrative around the concerns that are being raised up. If they are still just using the basic data fields that are needed for a national level submissions, I'd say go back and start looking at what locally information do you need. There's lots of things that they could be looking at. What are the trigger points for people speaking up? Why now? Many of the concerns that have been raised, people have sat on for a while. So what makes them suddenly on a Monday morning decide, right, today is the day I'm going to speak up? We don't fully understand that. We also don't report on how many times has the person spoken up prior to coming to the Guardians, and that will give us the confidence levels in the listening up and the following up. So I think, that again is a good route. So how many people have they gone to and how often? Also importantly, how often has the Guardian had to chase up for a response? That will be really telling. Once you start building up themes, it's a real indicator of how much of freedom to speak up culture you have.
Oh, that's so helpful, Bernie. Some really, really useful pointers for people to be thinking about going forward. There is no quick fixes there on improving culture. I just want to thank you for the part that you're playing within your organisation and much wider by taking part and writing blogs and trying to share your experience of what went wrong and how that can be averted. And we ignore our workforce speaking up at our peril, because organisational culture has such a key part to play in improving patient safety and worker wellbeing and safety. They're inextricably woven, aren't they? So thank you for taking time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it, Benny.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. We welcome your feedback, so please like, rate and comment. Thanks for listening.